Well, the government has released thousands of pages of documents around its Covid-19 decisions this afternoon. The documents include papers, minutes and key Covid advice given to the government up until April the 17th. Well, joining me now to give us an update is our political reporter, Jo Moir. Hi, Jo. Can you take us through exactly what these documents cover off?
Yeah, hi Nita. Well, you name it and they have absolutely dumped it today. We have got a lot of information in regards to particular areas like, for example, the alert levels and the restrictions for those, border closures, education, housing, that wage subsidy information, the income support measures that have kicked in, offshore issues, things around borders and just that general support for the economy. Now, journalists have been asking for these cabinet papers and advice related to all of this decision making around the COVID-19 lockdown for a number of weeks now, and this is the first significant dump of information that we've seen.
So what exactly do all the documents tell us, Jo?
So it's all hands on deck in the RNZ offices at the moment, trying to work our way through these literally hundreds and hundreds of documents. So I can give you some key findings of what we have found so far, broken down across a few areas. So if we look at the repatriation issue, this is these Mercy flights. Now what we've found is that the government expects it could cost up to $14 million to get New Zealanders who are stranded overseas back home. Now that figure is specific to those people who are stranded in high-risk countries. Basically, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade decided that they would break it down into high, moderate and low risk. In terms of those people in low risk countries, they're not a priority, they won't be sorted out. However, the high risk is obviously the main one here. Now, there are more than 3,000 New Zealanders in those high-risk countries. They haven't named which countries they are, but as we know, only 300 have actually come home at this point on Mercy flights, and that's only been to an expense of $2 million. So still a long way to go before we reach that $14 million figure. Now, in terms of how they've structured these flights, there's been quite a bit of criticism from people about the cost of them. We've learnt that it was a flat fee. So what they've done is they have attached a $1,500 cost for flights up to 4 hours long, those repatriation flights, $3,500 for 4 to 14 hours, and then $5,500 for flights over 14 hours. Now, obviously, the taxpayer is picking up a pretty big bill here as well, as they are heavily subsidised. What we now know is that the cost to the taxpayer on average per passenger coming home is approximately $12,500. Now, looking at contact tracing and community transmission, what we've found out is that in mid-March, the government believed it could manage contact tracing for only 10 active cases at that point. But as we know, there were more cases than that already in mid-March. So that point was March the 17th. We were doing 700 tests a day at that stage, only able to contact trace 10. However, on that day in New Zealand, it was announced that we had 11 confirmed cases and 2 probable cases of COVID-19 in this country. So the National Management Crisis Centre also gave advice to the COVID ministerial group. They said that they didn't have confidence in the reported rates around community transmission, which is obviously one of these key areas that we need to look at when moving through the alert levels. On April the 15th, the Crisis Centre said there was undetected community transmission around about 3 weeks earlier, but they didn't know how widespread it was. It said a significant amount of cases had missing information and others had been under investigation for a long time, which reduced its confidence in the data around that community transmission. Just to flick through a couple more areas quickly, support for business. There was advice from Inland Revenue and Treasury that they strongly opposed any suggestion of removing GST to bolster the economy. They were concerned that it would create significant administrative issues, so they strongly opposed that one. In terms of accommodation for those who are coming back to be quarantined, now the temporary accommodation service only ended up getting roughly about half of the $15 million of funding that it said it needed to quarantine those thousands of people who were rushing home. Now, before it had even got the money, it paid a company $2 million to secure 2,000 camper vans and booked hundreds of hotel rooms as it expected those people to start flowing back. At that point, Cabinet only granted it $8 million, so there was a bit of a gap there. And just lastly, on China, officials in early February had no accurate information whatsoever on how many offshore Chinese nationals held valid work visas which would allow them to come back to New Zealand. Obviously, China was a big concern at the time, as that was where COVID-19 had completely taken over large parts of the country, but Immigration New Zealand was unable to provide the Minister with information around how many Chinese nationals would actually be able to come back into New Zealand on those visas they held.
Right, a huge amount of information there. Thanks so much, Jo. Can you why now? Why was this all released just now?
So, I mean, it's always the intention that Cabinet government will release this sort of information, and it varies, I guess, on issues as to when they do release this sort of information around big announcements. There's obviously been a lot going on, and there's obviously been a lot more announcements in a rapid pace as well because of the circumstances around COVID-19. There's also been a lot of criticism about the lack of transparency to date, given how much money has been spent already. So I guess this will go a long way to rectifying that. There is, of course, a question of timing, though. It's a Friday afternoon. They know that the number of people watching, reading, engaged in news on a Friday afternoon is a lot lower than normal. So it does seem a little bit cynical, the timing.
Noted. And is there anything that hasn't been released yet? Any big gaping holes in this information?
So this information that we have received is only dated up to April the 17th. So of course there has been a number of policies and decisions that have been made since then, which we don't have that information for at the moment. That obviously includes what level 2 will look like. Obviously we only just received that information yesterday in terms of the details of that, so we don't have any of the advice around that sort of thing yet. The obvious missing piece of the puzzle here, of course, which has been in the news the last couple of days, is that Crown Law advice to Cabinet about whether the lockdown was actually legal. Now, as we know, the Epidemic Response Committee, which is chaired by the opposition leader Simon Bridges, has summoned senior public servants to actually provide that advice. Now, the Attorney-General, David Parker, has done a Facebook Live this afternoon, kind of responding to that, really, and he's accused the opposition of a dangerous attack on public servants and on the separation of powers between Parliament and the courts. He says that the matter should be resolved in the courts and not through a select committee.
Right, hey, thanks so much for that, Jo. That is our political reporter, Jo Moir there.